Okay, so we're going to begin the webinar. It is the last workshop of the 2017 Women's Wellness Program, and it's the first webinar of the series. So a quick introduction, the Women's Wellness Program is a series of workshops run annually in collaboration with the U of T Family Care Office, the Family Housing, as well as the Community Safety Office. My name is Ayesha. I'm a Master's of Education practicum student from OISE, and I'm responsible for coordinating this year's workshop series. So we're trying out this webinar format in hopes that more women in the family housing will be able to access this workshop and the other workshops within the series that aren't able to physically make it to 30 Charles to the in-person workshops that we hold throughout the program. So a webinar recording will be available afterwards online and it'll be transcribed. So it is going to be accessible to those of you that are not able to make the live webinar. I'm going to take my video off and we're going to start with the presentation. So I do want to point to the chat box before we begin so that everybody knows. If you have any questions, please feel free to participate and I will respond to you as soon as I see the question. And also, if you have any requests for resources, we can definitely email those to you as well. So this is our agenda. The topic for today's webinar is power dynamics in the home. So recognizing that family structures are very diverse around the world and within Canada, as well as specifically within the family housing at U of T, there are different power dynamics that exist within the different relationships in the home, both with a partner or a spouse, but also with other family members. We're going to touch upon some of the communication strategies that can help improve these relationships and discuss what a healthy relationship looks like compared to an unhealthy relationship. And then we're going to end with a few resources. So here's a poll. Before we begin, I do encourage you to participate. Only live webinar attendees can participate in these polls. Results will be anonymous. I'd like you to think about the people in your family or the families around you or those that you see around the family housing or around Canada or even back home. So in the family, I'd like you to think about who has the most power or control. So the options are the father or husband, wife, mother, son, daughter, mother-in-law or grandmother, father-in-law or grandfather, or none of the above. So I'll give you a moment. So looking at these results, we're seeing 75% say the father or husband, 75% say the wife or mother. And then we're seeing daughter and father-in-law, followed by mother-in-law or grandmother. So the reason I brought this up is because family structures and power dynamics within the home can vary greatly throughout different cultures. And some families consist of parents and kids, or two parents, one parent, kids. Other households consist of several generations, parents, kids, grandparents, all in one home. So in every household, the power dynamics differ. And the results of this poll, although from a very small pool, but they do show sort of interesting results on your feelings of power and control in the home and how that is shaped by your culture and your own personal experiences. So that's just an introduction before we get into what that means and what that can look like. So regardless of our home situation, effective communication with those we live with can improve our home lives. It can also help reduce stress levels, improve our relationships, increase our energy, and generally just lead to a higher level of happiness. It's important to note that communication is not just verbal. There are nonverbal cues as well, like body language, but also listening. Listening is a huge component of effective communication. So when we think about conflict, which is which is an inevitable part of any kind of relationship, both within the home and outside the home. There are ways that we can effectively maneuver conflicts through effective communication in order to get to a proper result and lead to healthy relationships. Conflict is a normal part of healthy relationships. It's just a matter of dealing with it in a healthy way. So some of these tactics are talking face to face. So putting away technology, which can be difficult to do in this day and age. Beginning with a positive rather than focusing on the negative at the beginning, and not attacking or exaggerating. Focusing on the problem instead of on the person as the problem, but the problem at hand. And using reflective listening. So that means, focusing on the other person's point and reiterating it and repeating it in your own words to make sure that you understand it before moving forward. And using I statements. So that would mean, for example, saying something like, I feel hurt when you don't tell me that you're running late, rather than saying something like, you always run late and you don't tell me, because that seems less of an attack and it puts the onus on you. And then knowing when to take a time out and knowing that it's okay to take some space before you react. And finally, clarifying your needs is a way to work towards a resolution. So that's just because somebody loves you, they may think that they know what you need. But unless you tell them what it is that you need from them, they may not actually be able to make you happy, even if they want to. So here are some characteristics of a healthy relationship. I'm not going to read all of them. And it's not, of course, an exhaustive list, but there are some characteristics of healthy relationships that look a little bit different in different relationships. Again, within intimate relationships compared to other family relationships. But generally, this is a good starting list for what a healthy relationship looks like. And we're focusing on the home right now. So a few of the key points. One of them, again, to reiterate, is communication and having healthy conflict. So again, that means conflict does not have to be avoided, but it is dealt with in a healthy way through open communication. A few things such as having fun. There should be fun in every relationship, and each person not only focuses on having the relationship with the two of you, but also being okay and trusting one another to have relationships in other forms. So being able to spend time with your friends and families without an overt amount of jealousy, and forgiveness of oneself as well as others. So these are all different characteristics of what makes a relationship, again, with a spouse or with somebody else, healthy. So this is called the nonviolence wheel. The characteristics of the healthy relationship are represented here. And at the center, you'll see equality. So the various behaviors and characteristics that we just spoke of and that are written around the wheel, they lead to equality within a relationship. And some of these include economic trust and partnership, negotiation on decision making and in conflicts, respect, trust, honesty, accountability, and shared responsibility. So all of these are characteristics that lead to equality, and when there's equality in the relationship, that leads to a lack of violence. So here's a quick list of healthy versus unhealthy. So we were discussing healthy relationships are comfortable. There's respectfulness, specifically in intimate relationships, there should be a sexual respectfulness. So there's no forced sexual activity. There's independence and there's humor. Relationships are fun. Unhealthy relationships are intimidating and they can be abusive. And again, within intimate relationships, that could mean there's sexual abuse, in which case one partner may pressure or force another partner into sexual activity against his or her will. There's a dependency. So there's a feeling that I can't live without this person, or I'm actually afraid to leave this person. And there's hostility. So always sort of being afraid of the other person. So it's important to recognize that abuse it does not just mean physical abuse. So of course, physical abuse is one form of abuse, but there are also emotional and psychological forms of abuse, sexual, financial, and even neglect counts as abuse. And it's also important to note that the threat of any of these also counts as abuse. And abuse doesn't just happen by males to their female partners. It can be females who abuse as well. It's also not just spousal violence that is domestic abuse. Parents or parents' in laws, grandparents, and even children can abuse their caregivers. These kinds of characteristics can exist in any kind of relationship. So, looking briefly at different forms of abuse, this is the power and control wheel. So again, we went over physical abuse, so that can have many different forms: shoving, pushing, squeezing, kicking, choking, and they're a lot more easily recognizable, both within your own relationship, but also if you think about friends that you may have a concern with or neighbors. These are generally a little bit more noticeable. But sexual abuse is also something that needs to be recognized, and it's any unwanted sexual comments, contact, gestures, and anything that makes someone feel uncomfortable that is sexual in nature. And when emotional abuse occurs, often victims don't even realize that there's abuse occurring. So, emotional abuse can consist of making a partner feel insecure, playing mind games, isolating the partner, pressuring them into giving up other relationships or activities that they may enjoy, using intimidation, economic, financial control, or anything that makes the victim feel intimidated or unsafe around their partner. So I'm going to pause just now and just if want to mention if anyone has questions or wants clarification on anything, please do feel free to use the chat box. And again, if you need specific resources that you want to share with a friend, please let us know and I'll be happy to email them to you in the upcoming days. So if we look within this in this violence and power and control wheel, these are some, again, if you look at some of the specifics that are written within the wheel, these are, again, not an exhaustive list, but an important to recognize some of these behaviors and characteristics. This wheel does refer to the victim as a female or her, but as we noted previously, it's not always a male to female victim. It's not always a female victim and a male abuser. It can be female to female, male to male, and it can be in non-intimate relationships as well. But because of the overwhelming statistics, this wheel does refer to her as the victim. So that's just something to note. So this is a cartoon that I encourage you to take a look at, this comic, and look at some of the sentiments. See if any of these fears resonate with you, or maybe with someone that you know, a neighbor or a friend. These are excuses that we often make for those that we love when they're showing abusive tendencies. These are all warning signs that the relationship is unhealthy and that there's a lack of balance and power and control. These count as red flags that something could get worse. So these can be thoughts that we might make after a certain behavior or consistently based on an ongoing action. So I'll take a moment once you read it. This is called the cycle of abuse. As you can see, abuse doesn't necessarily occur constantly, but between moments of calm. So the cycle doesn't necessarily always follow in this flow exactly, but most often it does. Abuse, whether physical, sexual, emotional, it occurs, then it's followed by a process of reconciliation. So reconciliation and making up can look like an apology, promising not to do it again, blaming the victim sometimes for provoking the abuse, denial that it was really any kind of big problem or any kind of abuse, or even giving the victim gifts as an apology. So this is followed generally by a moment of calm. So that can be the abuser acting as though there was never any problem or that the abuse never happened, or just generally getting along. But then tension starts to build again. And sometimes that can take weeks, sometimes it can take months, sometimes it can take hours or even minutes. But it eventually leads to further abuse. And abuse can occur, again, you can have physical mixed with sexual, mixed with emotional. It can be just one or the other. It really does look very different in all relationships. But generally, it does follow this kind of abuse cycle. Effective abuse on a victim can be very diverse, but it tends to lead to fear, insecurity, self loathing, a feeling of doom, trauma that can be long or short term, and possibly even worse. The effective abuse on children, both through witnessing and through, of course, direct abuse, can have long term trauma, which lasts well into adulthood. In fact, research has shown that children who experience abuse, either directly or indirectly by witnessing within the household, um, are more likely to develop depression, stress related disorders, and often express more hostility and aggression. It's also been shown that the effect on children sometimes leads to intergenerational abuse. So they replicate what they've witnessed or experienced in their own relationships as adults. They often find that when there is an abusive relationship, specifically within intimate relationships, if they look back and actually speak to the abuser, it turns out that the abuser came from a family that had abuse in it. And often it's generational. So it was one parent was abusive to another parent, and the child witnessed it, replicated it with their own relationships, whose children then replicated it with their own relationships. And it really does go down throughout history into the different generations. So that's another important reason to recognize what abuse can look like, and that it doesn't only have short-term effects, but long-term effects on other generations and well into the future. So if you know anybody that does fear that you do, if you do fear that anybody you know might have an abuser that may be tracking their internet usage, there are steps that can be taken to clear the history. It is not 100% foolproof. It can't 100% remove all of the history in browsing, but internet search clearing and browsing history can be reduced by erasing your cache and history. So depending on the different browsers, there's different ways to do it. We're not going to get into detail on how to do it. But just to keep in mind, when looking up sensitive websites, it is advisable to open an incognito or private tab. So different browsers, again, do this differently. But essentially, usually when you open up a tab, say on Google Chrome or on Firefox, there's usually an option if you right click that allows you to browse privately, and that doesn't save the information into your history. So quickly looking at how to clear history, and you may want to erase your history when we complete today's webinar as a test, or if you feel that someone in your household may be tracking you and you don't want them to see that you participated in this webinar. So without getting into too much detail, again, if you have questions specifically on how to do it, you can get in touch afterwards, or even just search how to clear my cache and history. But usually at the top right of your browser, you'll see something called Internet Options or History. And then if you open it, there'll be an option to clear your history and your cache. And you can choose how long you want to go back. You can do it from the beginning of time, or you can do it from the last hour, etc. So as a member of the U of T community, there are several services that you or your neighbors or your friends can access if they feel insecure or unsafe, or if they're worried or you're worried that they may be in an unhealthy relationship with either a spouse or someone else in the home, or even just want to discuss the relationships in more depth before making any decisions. So here are a few. There's safety planning, which is offered at the Community Safety Office. It is free. There's a website as well as a phone number. And they help from the beginning to even recognizing that there's something that may be wrong to actually safety planning and getting individuals out of unsafe homes. There are also counseling and psychological services that are offered through U of T Health and Wellness. These are not only for people that are in unhealthy relationships. These are actually offered to anyone within the U of T community for something like mindfulness to actual one-on-one psychological services to deal with the effects of abuse or unhealthy relationships and violence. There is also emergency help through campus police. If anything urgent is happening and you need to get out or your neighbor needs to get out, always call 911. If it's a little less urgent but does require attention and it's on the U of T campus, campus police can help. And for anyone that is staff or faculty, there's the EFAP, and that's a benefit that offers different sort of counseling and services specifically for faculty and staff. There are also resources within Toronto. So if someone you believe may be experiencing this kind of abuse or violence and they're not part of the U of T community, there are resources offered throughout the city for anyone within any um, through any throughout the process of any kind of unhealthy relationship. So that includes shelters, safety planning, crisis center, legal services, counseling, victim support, and other supports. And any of these organizations can help throughout the process or has resources to help throughout the process. So it's not that you have to go to one, which is the shelter, and then go to another one for the legal services, and then another one for safety planning. If you go to any of them, they would be able to help you or your friend or your neighbor with any of the steps in the process and making sure that it's all taken care of from the beginning to the end in a way that works for them. These are also, of course, open to people within the U of T community, regardless, but also open to those that are not within the U of T community. So, I would love for anyone to mention any questions in the chat box. Again, if you have anything that is specific that you don't want to write to everybody, you can get in touch with the Family Care Office. I would encourage you to email them or phone family.care@utoronto.ca. The phone number is 416-978-0951. And we're happy to send you any specific resources that you think might help a neighbor or a friend or even you.